let's see, record. Okay, that's what I want to do. That one of the things this morning is to look at the opening, at different prayer books and how they start the day, because it's kind of interesting how they interpret the Jewish legal codes as to how we should act in the synagogue. But before that, let's get, wait, what did I just do with my, there we go. Okay. I just wanted to review something from last week that we looked at. We just basically had time last week to look at two opening poems, I guess you would call it. We're familiar with one of them. It's Adon Olam. In traditional prayer books, Ma Tovu and Adon Olam are the first things one says. Ma Tovu as one enters into the synagogue, and then Adon Olam as kind of an introduction to prayer. And I just wanted to go over some of the concepts that came out of having those two poems as the beginning of worship. So the Ma Tovu we called, based on Dr. Reuven Kilman's work, a psychological introduction to prayer. All and the ideas that come out of Ma Tovu in that little poem is that everybody's welcome, and the goal is to feel that one is praying before God, not before a ritual object, because as we read through the poem, first the worshiper, overwhelmed with the Spirit, bows down to the ark. But by the end of the poem, he is praying before God. And that's the idea, is to have the sense of God is right there with you. And finally, anytime one prays is an appropriate time for prayer. That was one of the questions that the worshiper is wondering about. When's appropriate time? An 8 ratzon for prayer, and basically when one prays, that's the appropriate time. The Adon Olam was, Dr. Kilman calls it a theological introduction to prayer. And as we go through that poem, the ideas that come through are God is before time, God is present time, God is future. It's a way of expressing that God is always, that God is not contingent on anything in the world that we experience. God doesn't need anything in the world to exist. That's very different from the pagan idea, in which the gods were beholden to fate, but God's not contingent on anything. God is infinite temporally, that is no limit time-wise and no limit spatially. God's everywhere. So that God is transcendent, God is the creator of all outside of the world, but God's also immanent. The last lines speak of the poet says, God is with me. God cares about me. God's there to listen to me. So with that introduction, we're now ready to begin our prayer day. The concept of these morning blessings, comes from the fact that that there was, during the temple period, before we had synagogues, and it was just the one temple, there was already this proto service. The Mishnah, which was put together in the beginning of the 3rd century of the Common Era, gives us an idea of what it was like during the temple period. It says they would say the Baruch Hu, they would say a blessing. It doesn't tell us what the blessing was about, but they would say a blessing. Then they would say the 10 Commandments. Then they recite the Shema. They would recite the 3 paragraphs that we're familiar with the Shema, that we still recite. And then they would say the blessing after the Shema that we're familiar with, Emet V'Yetziv. Then they would say a blessing about the ritual service. They would have the blessing, the priestly blessing, and Shabbat. They would have additional blessing. And so that's kind of the structure that we have today in our worship service is very similar to that. We don't say the Ten Commandments anymore. That was very important. The rabbinic period, nobody really knows exactly who they were referring to, but possibly the Christians, the early Christians, who were they wanted to de-emphasize. The rabbis wanted to de-emphasize the Ten Commandments as the only commandments that were spoken by God to the people, that and that it was much more than that. It was the entire Torah that God revealed to the Jewish people at Sinai. And so they wanted to de-emphasize the Ten Commandments. So that could be the early Christians who accepted some of the basic Jewish ideas, but limited, not, they didn't observe all of the mitzvot. But otherwise it's pretty close to what we have today. I mean, in terms of a skeletal service, the idea of a pre-service, of a preparation service that we call Psuke de Zimra, morning blessings, that is indicated in another section in the Mishnah, in the section called Brachot, blessings, where it says the early pious ones waited for an hour and then they prayed in order to direct their heart to God. So what does it mean where is it here? The Hasidim Rishonim Hayu Shohim, they would, what does it mean to Shoheh Asha'a Echat Umit Palalim? What were they doing during that time of waiting and hanging out? They weren't just sitting there, they were doing something. And so we assume that there was some kind of preparatory recitations. When we get to the Psalms, one possibility is that they read the entire book of Psalms every morning before they began worship. But they did something. They were praying, they were meditating, they were doing something. The idea comes that before we get into our significant prayers, and again, what I want to say, the idea that you pray before you pray, what does that mean? So the service that we're praying, what we consider the main service, the Shema and the blessings around the Shema, the Amidah prayer, they're not just prayers from the heart. It's not just about every morning opening our hearts up to God. There's a motivation, there's a purpose, there's a direction, there's an intentionality to the words that we're saying in what we call prayer. And so to get to that point, to be able to say the Shema and the Amidah with the proper intention, you have to get in the mood to pray and to direct your heart. And that's what Psuke de Zimra and these early morning blessings are supposed to do. Now, the reason why I opened up, I have a lot of prayer books here to see how to start the day, is the codes, Jewish legal codes, give us different directions in how to start the day. Sometimes it seems like we're supposed to start our prayerful day before we get to the synagogue. Just as we're waking up, we're saying blessings as we're going through the day. It's understood that at some point, many of these morning blessings were transferred over to synagogue worship, because there was a sense that people didn't do this, but if we're all together, we'll be able to recognize this list of blessings that we should say every day. And so it was transferred into the synagogue. But because of that kind of confusion as to what you should say when you get up and what you should say when you get to the synagogue, we have different examples in these prayer books. So for example, the prayer book that we use, the daily prayer book, it says at the very beginning on page 2, when we start, it says, after visiting the washroom, you recite this blessing over the body, Asher Yatzar, which says, blessed are you, God, who used divine wisdom to fashion human beings. furnishing them with all sorts of cavities and internal conduits. And if one of them doesn't work, if they don't open when they're supposed to open or close when they're supposed to close, we're in trouble. So in this book, it says, do it when you go to the bathroom. Well, you're going to the washroom right after you get out of bed. So is that something we should say in the synagogue or something we say at home? Then this is our prayer book. Upon arriving in the synagogue, we say Matovu. That's what we talked about last week. We put on our talit, we put on our tzitzit with the appropriate blessings, and then we begin the formal chanting for the morning. We start with blessings over the Torah, and we continue with blessing for the soul. So that's our prayer book. But I think it's in this one. This is the Koren prayer book, which is a traditional prayer book. It's a newer one. And he's got, it's interesting, I don't think he had the Al Netilat Yadayim. Maybe he did. Yeah. And also because the codes tell us that the first thing we do when we wake up, we should wash our hands. So that blessing is also said right before we go to the bathroom. In the Koren prayer book, they do the same thing. When you wake up, you wash your hands, you go to the washroom, you say this blessing over the body, and then you say the blessing over the soul. So here, according to the Koren prayer book, you say this blessing, Elohai neshama she'atata bi tohorahi, my God, the soul you placed within me is pure, you created it, you formed it, you breathed it into me. That blessing is said at home right after you go to the bathroom and you say the body blessing. So you have a different, and that's because in the codes, the Shulchan Aruch says that when the first thing we should say when we wake up in the morning is that blessing about the soul, because we woke up. I remember the kids at the day school, they get a little freaked out because they would be taught that when we go to sleep, our soul leaves our body and goes to the angels, to God. I forget exactly if it was to God, but I think it was to the angels. It goes above, and then when we wake up in the morning, it comes back to our bodies. We're restored, and that's what that Elohai Neshama is about. It's Elohai, God. The soul that you've placed within me is pure. As long as the soul is within me, I thank God. So we're grateful for the return of that. Of the soul. So in the codes, it suggests that you say it right away. Anyway, the kids would be freaked out because, then they were afraid to go to sleep because their soul would be taken from them. But I remember talking to Miriam and asking her, well, could you have to teach it this way? They're freaking out. No, that's our tradition. All right. So, so the code suggests we say it first thing when we wake up. And so the Koren prayer book has it in that order that, you go to the bathroom, you say the prayer over your body, grateful for the body, and then you say the prayer over your soul because I don't think it gives any indication there. Yeah, because that's in the codes, it's like right away. In the art scroll, it suggested, in the art scroll, it suggested many people, they also say the first thing you do when you wake up, no. Art scroll is different. Art scroll has everything. They start from the very beginning of coming to the synagogue. And they have Matovu and Adon Olam. And then they have the blessings of washing your hands and the body, and then followed by the blessings of Torah, and followed by the blessings of soul. And they have a note here that says, although many hold that the blessing Netilat Yadayim, washing of your hands, should be recited immediately after the ritual washing of hands upon arising, others customarily recited at this point. So you see here that we have some differences in how to read the codes and how that translates into the Siddur. What order do you do these early morning blessings? And partially it comes from the fact that the in the Talmud, where these blessings are described, it does seem like it is going through the motions as we go through the morning. So as soon as we wake up, well, first of all, if you're going to if you wake up, most people go to the bathroom. And so therefore, and even before you go to the bathroom, you should wash your hands. So that's the beginning act of your day, washing your hands. Not just for cleanliness, but it's kind of a spiritual washing. That's why it's al netilat yadayim. Netilah is to lift up. So we lift up our hands because now we're going to be ready to use our hands for holy things, and they should be cleansed to do this. So we start with washing our hands. Then of course you go to the bathroom, and you should say the blessing. Anytime you go to the bathroom, we should say the blessing, grateful for that our body is working. And then it's a little unclear, but it seems that you would say, or maybe even before you got up, even before you after, or I guess you'd want to wash your hands, but early in the morning when you're waking up, you're going to say Elohai Neshama, because again, this notion, my soul has returned. I'm awake. My consciousness has returned to me. And so we begin there with these two blessings for the soul, the restoration of the soul and the body. And then according to the Talmud, it goes through the whole list of what we do when we wake up. You open your eyes. When you open your eyes, that's when you say the blessing over God restores sight to the blind. And when I stand up, that's when I say the blessings Okev Kefufim, who straightens those who are bent over. And it's this list of actions, everything we do as we go through the morning ritual, just natural processes, we are constantly blessing God for every one of these gifts. However, later on it was determined, as I mentioned earlier, that by the legalists, the halachists, that people weren't really doing this. They don't know all the exact blessings. Maybe they don't know the exact wording of the blessings. And so they transferred the whole experience to the synagogue. And we go through these blessings now in the synagogue. So I wanted to start with the blessings for the body, the soul, and body, soul, and Torah. Because here's another choice that a person creating a Siddur has to make. What order do you put these key three blessings? Asher Yatzar, which is great gratitude for our body and that the body works properly, that God created a body that works properly. Elohai Neshama, gratitude that my soul, my consciousness has been restored to me, and that I recognize that God created it. And in that blessing, we also acknowledge the concept of the world to come, because we say, the soul that you've given me is pure. You created it, you formed it, you breathed it into me, right? That's a reference to the creation of Adam, the first Adam. And the Atam Shamra B'Kirbi, and you watch over this soul of mine. In the future, it is going to be taken from me, right? That's death. But then it will be restored to me in the future. That's a reference to the Jewish notion that at the end of time, after Messiah, when we have this time of return to Eden, the future world, the world to come, that then will be the official judgment period when everybody's going to be judged. Well, the only way to be judged fairly is body and soul together. God can't just judge our souls because our bodies are very much involved in any good or bad that we're doing. So that's the traditional view, is that we have this physical restoration as well as a return of the soul. And that's what that's referring to. And in the future, the soul will be restored to me. And therefore, all the time that I do have my soul within me, I am very grateful. So that's another prayer. prayer about the soul. And then we have this prayer about Torah that we're supposed to do. Before we engage in any Torah study, we're supposed to recite blessings of Torah. And there's three of them. One is the blessing Lasok b'divrei Torah, to engage in Torah study. Another one is gratitude for the sweetness of Torah study. May you make the Torah that's in my mouth and in my people's mouth, make it sweet. We and our descendants should also continue to study Torah. Praise are you who teaches Torah to the people Israel. And then we have the third blessing, which is what we're familiar with from when we read Torah publicly, is the Asher Bachar Banu Mikol Hamim, that you've chosen us from all the peoples to give us Torah. So it's those three blessings. And then, of course, because when you do a bracha, you have to act on it right away. And so that's why we have these three passages, one from Torah, the priestly blessing, one from the Mishnah Peah, which refers to Torah study. And the third one comes from the Talmud in Shabbat, which talks about that all of these things, anything you do, any of these mitzvot that you do, you get rewarded not only in the world to come, but also in this world. And we'll get to that in a moment, what those types of activities are. But I wanted to just state that sometimes you'll see in a prayer book, like in our weekday prayer book, where did I do with it? Here. Weekday prayer book, we have page 2. The first thing we said was the blessing over the body. And then when we start on page 6, at the top of the page, it's the blessing over Torah, and then followed by Elohai Neshama. Probably because, one of the reasons why Elohai Neshama comes after the blessings of Torah is because, again, in the Talmud, when they're describing the blessings that we say as we're going through our day, the first blessing is the blessing over the restoration of our soul. And then it goes into this list of, and when you do each one of these activities, there's a blessing on each one. So those are connected. But in our Shabbat prayer book, the blessing over the body is the first thing we say in the synagogue. And the second thing is the blessing over the soul. So there's a little bit of a difference. Why the difference? Well, it depends on, again, how the editor of the prayer book is conceiving, what's motivating them. Are they motivated by the codes which suggest, or I should say the Talmud, which suggests that Elohai Neshama is connected to this list of blessings through our daily activities? Or is it that they're motivated by this notion, this traditional notion, that body and soul go together? The argument that one should say the blessing over body and soul one after the other is because the second blessing, Elohai Neshama, does not begin with Baruch, but with that formula of Baruch Atah. And it ends with a blessing, Baruch Atah Hashem Machazir Neshabot Nifgari Metim, but it doesn't begin. Whereas the blessing over the body begins Baruch Atah Hashem Elokeinu Melech Olam, and it concludes Baruch Atah Hashem Rofei Kol Basar Mafli Alasot, which is very similar to what we do in the Amidah, right? In the Amidah, we begin with the Avot. Let me make sure I get the correct, like the words properly here. Baruch Atah Hashem Elokeinu Velokei Avoteinu, Elokei Abraham, Elokei Yitzhak, Elokei Yaakov. And then we conclude with the blessing, Baruch Atah Hashem, Magen Abraham. All the blessings that follow do not begin with Baruch Atah, but they conclude with Baruch Atah. It's this idea of like a chain. So the first blessing gets the starts with Baruch Atah, and then each one afterwards just concludes. The paragraph concludes with Baruch Atah, as if you've built a chain, and you don't need to start the following blessing, the succeeding blessing, with Baruch Atah, because you've already said it at the beginning. So that's one argument for, well, obviously these two things go together. Body and soul go together. That's the concept of the notion in rabbinic Judaism that the body and soul are judged together. And so therefore we start with the blessing for the body and we continue with the blessing of the soul. We don't need to say Baruch Atah at the beginning. However, the code suggests that that's not why you say Elohai Neshama without the Baruch Atah formula at the beginning. They suggest it's because whenever you say a blessing of gratitude, you don't need, and that's a blessing of gratitude, you don't need to start with Baruch Atah. So they have a different idea of, and therefore they suggest that the blessing for Torah comes first before we say Elohai Neshama. Because again, they're considering we've moved Elohai Neshama from our bed and wake up into the synagogue. And so therefore the very first blessing we should say when we're in the synagogue, because the assumption is we've gone to the bathroom before we left the house and said a Sheriat Tsar over the body, the very first blessing is we should start the day with Torah, the blessing over Torah. When we put all of these three things together, however you arrange them, body, soul, and then Torah, becomes then an expression of gratitude for our cognitive abilities. So really, however you order them, you have these three basic core anthropology. This is basically the description of the anthropology of the human person. We are a body, we are a spirit, a consciousness, we are a mind. And those three aspects, we express our gratitude for, and that they all go together. So whether you put the soul before the Torah blessings or the Torah blessings before the soul, as long as you're saying all three of them at the very beginning of the day, you've expressed this gratitude for the human anthropology. I wanted to talk a little bit about the text. What do we study? I think this is so interesting. The choices that are made when we study, for the examples of Torah study. Once you say the blessing for Torah, you've got to act on it. And so we study Torah and study a little piece of Torah, of Mishnah and Talmud. And I think it's so interesting what our sages chose for us. These are not lefty liberal types who lenient, I don't know what you call them. I don't know, maybe Reformed Jews, primacy of morality type of Jews, right? They're really into, these guys were, halakha was essential to their life. But look at the choices. They didn't choose kind of classic mitzvah sections. They chose sections about kindness, about compassion. The opening, the Torah blessing that the Torah section that we study is the priestly blessings, which of course is what the priest would bless the people with. And they're all acts asking God to show favor and graciousness. It ends with the word shalom, that you may be blessed with peace. The section from the Mishnah are this list of things that have no limit. All right, there's no minimum, there's no maximum to these types of mitzvot. And the very first one is Peah. Peah, which is the section of the field in which the farmer has to can't cultivate. He's not allowed to harvest. He's not allowed to harvest that corner, and you have to leave some amount. You could even, one tiny amount, but you can also leave as much of your field as you wanted for the poor. There's no limit to it, and that's obviously that's a mitzvah, an ethical mitzvah. The other two are bikurim and ra'ayon. Those are offerings that were brought to the temple. But then the next one is gimilut chasadim, right? It's acts of loving kindness. Finally, or closing, we close with Talmud Torah, study of Torah. The section after that from the Talmud also, look at the mitzvot that we're talking about. It's not here about kashrut. It's not offerings to the temple. They're exclusively, well, not exclusively, because some of them have to do with Torah study, but they're focused on acts of kindness. So these are the deeds that yield immediate fruit and continue to yield fruit in time to come. And here's the list: honoring parents, deeds of loving kindness, attending the house of study punctually, providing hospitality, visiting the sick, helping the needy bride, attending to the dead, probing the meaning of prayer, making peace between one person and his fellow. I don't know where they got the idea of husband and wife. I haven't found that text, but it's a good one though. And the study of Torah is most basic of them all, is essential to all of this.
What is it about husband and wife?
That making peace between a husband and wife.
It specifically says husband and wife?
Yeah, that's in our Shabbat. In the Shabbat prayer book, they've added that uvein ish le ishto. But that's not, I don't know where they found it. I'm guessing that it had to be in a commentary, a Talmudic commentary, because it's not in the Talmud section in Shabbat. So they've added that in there. But knowing this prayer book, they didn't just put it in there willy-nilly. Somewhere there is a text that adds ish le ishto. But in any case, it's making peace between people, and then and Torah is basic to them all, is essential to any mitzvot that we do, knowing Torah. So, I was going to say that in our Shabbat prayer book, we also get a choice. The Torah verses, if you don't wish, you don't have to say the priestly blessings. They give you an alternative from Leviticus. Some verses from Leviticus, the holiness code, and v'ahavta l'reacha kamocha, love your fellow as yourself. And this was understood. This was this was found. This was a suggested by, I had it here somewhere. Oh, wait a minute, where's my text here? This was this, I know what it was. In my notes, I had Solomon Luria, but I don't think that was right. I think it was Isaac Luria. Isaac Luria, the great Kabbalist, suggested that one should start the day saying that I accept upon myself this mitzvah of v'ahavta l'recha kamocha. Love your neighbor, love your fellow as yourself. So
just yesterday's reading in One Day at a Time, they referred to this love your neighbor as yourself.
Yeah.
And they explain just as you would value one part of your body, yourself, more than another. For instance, you might consider your eyes or your heart more vital than your finger or your toe, but still you would cautiously protect them all and consider them all important. So you should view other people who have different qualities, different abilities, but the least of them even, you should give as much respect as to the most of them, to the most auspicious ones, just as you treat every part of your body. Some, even though they seem more important than others, they're all vitally important.
Very nice. That's nice. What I wanted to emphasize was that we start the day with the Torah study examples we're given as having to do with compassion. And I think that's really essential, that we begin the day with this idea of peace, grace,
Chaim v'chesed
Chaim
v'rachamim.
v'chesed. Yeah. That's the way. These are the choices. And I'm just teasing about, oh, it's not like this wasn't written by some reform, left-wing reform rabbi. I'm teasing because they love to focus on those aspects, but our tradition does too. From beginning, and when reform movement focuses on this, or hopefully the conservative movement does too, but anybody who focuses on this this is essential. This is essential to our understanding of Judaism and our relationship to God, and that our prayer book begins the day with this notion of the study of Torah that we want to do is going to lead us to thinking about compassionate acts and ethical behavior. The last thing I think I wanted to focus on today was, and we just have a couple more minutes before we finish, and then I'll take a little break before we get to the Talmud class, is this list of blessings again. The list of blessings begins, the first one is Asher Nat, this is well, it depends on what prayer book you're working, but this is a morning blessing, the list of morning blessings. First one is Asher Natan L'Sechvi Bina L'Havchin Bein Yom U'Bein Laila. Again, this in the Talmud, you hear the rooster caw in the morning, and it's daybreak, and you say, praise are you, O Lord our God, who distinguishes between night and day.
Who gives rooster the ability to.
Right, who gives the rooster the ability to distinguish night and day. Sechvi also, if you're looking at the translation in the Shabbat prayer book, it doesn't say anything about a rooster, because Sechvi can be rooster. It can also be I think in the book of Job, it's translated as mind, brain. And so they translate it here as enabling us to distinguish day from night. But in any case, you see that daybreak, and you say this blessing. Then in a moment, I'll get to the next three blessings, but I want to begin with Pokeach Ivrim. We begin with Pokeach Ivrim, who opens the eyes of the blind. You open your eyes, or you see your hand. You can see the distinction between your hand now, because it's a little lighter. Malbish Arumim, you start to get dressed. Matir Asurim is you stretch. But the blessing is who frees the captives. Zokev Kefufim, again, you're standing up straight, and that's who raises the way they translate it here, raises the downtrodden, but helps the bent over straighten up. Rokaha Aretz Alamayim, who created, they translate here, let's do a little more literal translation. Who spread forth the earth above the waters. That's when you put your foot down on the ground. What's the next one? Shasali Kol Tzorki, has provided for me all my needs. That's according to you put your shoes on. Interesting that you've got all your needs. You've got shoes which help you with walking. Hamechin Mitzadei Gaver, who guides the steps of man. That's what you say when you first start to walk, or as you get to wake up in the morning. Ozer Yisrael Bigvura, who girds Israel with might. That's when you put on your belt. Oter Yisrael Batifara, who crowns Israel with glory. That's when you put your hat on. And Hanoten Layev Koach, who gives strength to the weary. You're now waking up. And then comes the blessing, who removes sleep from my eyes and slumber from my eyelids. That's when you start to wash your face. Again, that blessing is like in the Birnbaum prayer book. There's a split between that blessing and the next paragraph. And is it the same way in our prayer book? Our daily prayer book, it's also the same way. There's a paragraph break. In the Shabbat prayer book, there isn't, and there shouldn't be, because the codes tell us that blessing, Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam, hama'avir she'na me'enai utnuma me'afafai is connected to what follows. And you're not, if you're listening to it, the person in shul, you shouldn't say amen after that blessing because it's all one paragraph.
And that's why we're not supposed to really say it out loud.
Oh, you can say it out loud. You just shouldn't say amen after you hear it. You should just recite the whole paragraph. The whole paragraph fits together. So there shouldn't be a break. But there shouldn't be an amen after the words Sheiname Einai Utnumame Afafai.
Isn't it a pie?
Afafai. Right. And then it goes right into Vayihi Ratzon Milfanecha. So you go right into it. So you shouldn't say amen after the first sentence.
We are directed to say it silently in the holiday prayer book, I think. And I thought, we don't normally say it out loud, except for Rob, who rebels.
Well, it's okay to say it out loud. In the Shabbat prayer book that we have, it's just all in one paragraph. It's connected the way it is in the Talmud. Whereas in our daily prayer book, the editor has split it, and I'm not sure why he did that.
But I'm referring to the High Holiday prayer book, I think.
Oh, the High Holiday prayer book? Oh, that may be. I don't have that one in front of me.
It specifically says either you silently or in an undertone or something like that.
Yeah, see, in fact, even in the art scroll, it even makes a note. Although many Sidurim begin a new paragraph at Vihi Ratzon, the following is one long blessing that ends with Le'amo Yisrael. So you can say it out. You can start the bracha. You can start that paragraph out loud. You just shouldn't say amen after the words me'afapai.
Pie is good. Pie is very good.
Pie is always very good. Okay, the last things I just wanted to look at were those three blessings that we've changed in the conservative prayer book. The three blessings, Sha'asani B'Tzalmo, Sha'asani Yisrael, Sha'asani Ben Chorin, who's made me, in our prayer book, the way it's translated, who's made me in the divine image, who's made me a Jew, who's made me free. Originally, those were all in the negative. Who has not made me a heathen, who has not made me a woman, who has not made me
a slave.
No, wait. The first one is who has not made me a Gentile, who has not made me a slave, and who has not made me a woman. It was changed because the reason why it's in there, and it makes sense, there's a logic to it. Each of those categories, Gentile, slave, woman, starting with Gentile, they all have less obligations of mitzvot than males do, than a male Jew, a free male Jew. Goy has no obligation of mitzvot other than the ethical principles. A slave has some obligations, and slave and women are not obligated to positive time-bound mitzvot, although Jewish women, do have a few other mitzvot that slaves don't have. So it was a way of saying, thank you for putting me in this category where I am obligated to observe all the mitzvot. It's also borrowed from, I believe, there was a Roman, they'd also begin their day with certain blessings or praises, and they would be grateful that they weren't a barbarian, they weren't a slave, and they weren't a woman. So the rabbis kind of took their list and made it their own. But for our purposes in our day, the sense of saying something in the negative is not meaningful to us. And so therefore we've reversed it and we've put it in the positive. And that's one of the major changes that the conservative movement made at the very beginning of developing their own prayer books, to put it in the positive, because it was just felt to be insulting to put it in the negative, given the conditions that we lived in. I suppose if we did live in a society where women did not participate the way they participate in our communities today, if we lived in a society where we were constantly oppressed, we might say we might feel like thank God you didn't make me like my oppressor, but that's not the culture we live in. And so it doesn't really make sense to say it that way.
What does
So
Ben Chorin mean?
Ben Chorin,
Yes, I mean, I know that translated as a free individual, but what does it really mean?
well, well, Ben and bat can also mean status, right? Right, like bar mitzvah or bat mitzvah doesn't mean literally son of the commandments. It means a person obligated to observe the commandments. So it's a status. Chorin, chorin is free, but I'm trying to think what the root is, which I can't think of. But chorin is, yeah, usually chorin is understood as free, as opposed to an eved, who's a slave. We say that in the Haggadah, we also use the term chorin. So
Okay.
I'll have to look up the shoresh, the root of where it comes from. Okay, so we're gonna stop. Let me stop the recording here.